I'm Linda Brigham, 40 years old, and I command a classified Joint Special Operations Task Force for the United States Army. For 15 years, I watched my father tell anyone who would listen that his daughter was a government clerk, a joke he delivered at every family dinner, every wedding, every poker night. While I ran operations he'll never be cleared to know about. But when he said it in front of his old SEAL buddy, a man who knew exactly what my call sign meant, something shifted that no one in that kitchen was prepared for. Have you ever been dismissed by the one person whose respect you wanted most? Tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened that Sunday morning, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stop shrinking yourself for someone who never bothered to look closely enough, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about quiet dignity and hard-won truth. What happened when that black SUV pulled into my father's driveway might stay with you. My father was a sergeant major, 25 years of infantry, 2 combat patches, a chest full of ribbons, and a voice that could flatten a room without raising itself. He retired when I was 9 years old, and for the rest of my childhood, that retirement sat in the house like a third presence, not angry, not sad, just very large and very aware of itself. Jim Brigham was not a man who struggled with identity. He knew exactly what he was. What he never quite figured out was what to do with a daughter who turned out to be something he didn't have a word for. I grew up in Northern Virginia, in a house where discipline was the default language, and pride was something you showed by doing, not by saying. My father made his bed with military corners until I was in my 30s. He still does. He rises at 5:30 regardless of whether there is anything to rise for, because rising at 5:30 is what men who have served do, and he has never entirely stopped serving even though the Army stopped asking him to. I understood that about him before I could articulate it through pattern, through watching, through noticing which things in a house have weight. The thing I noticed first was the way other men stood when my father walked into a room. Not ramrod straight, nothing as obvious as that, just differently. A slight adjustment, a reorientation, the way a compass needle finds north. Jim Brigham had been a sergeant major, and sergeant majors are the last word between the officer and the man on the ground. They make sure the mission gets done right. I didn't know the definition when I was 9, but I understood the weight. I filed it away. He told me once, not long after he retired, that service was the only thing worth doing. We were driving home from his retirement ceremony, a formal affair with a flag presentation and speeches from men with short haircuts and steady hands, and the car was quiet in the way it gets after something significant. I was in the back seat in a dress my mother had picked out. On the drive home, he said it almost to himself. Service is the only thing worth doing. I believed him completely. He didn't teach me to serve. He just lived it, and I watched. That's how it works with fathers and daughters. The lesson isn't in what they say, it's in what they are. My mother, Sandra, was the quieter architecture of our household. She married Jim in 1982, which meant she had married the Army first and Jim second. She understood this, accepted it, built a life inside it. She was organized, steady, warm in a way that didn't require much demonstration. She packed lunches and attended school plays while Jim took calls from old unit commanders who needed nothing in particular but to hear a familiar voice. She was fluent in the language of making space for someone else to occupy the center. I grew up watching her do it and told myself I would be different. I was right about that. By the time I was 12, Rich Connell had come and gone from our house enough times to feel like a permanent fixture, even when he wasn't there. He was Jim's oldest friend from service, a Navy man, which Jim accepted with the specific tolerance of someone who has learned to respect the other branches without entirely understanding them. Rich was a senior chief petty officer in the Navy's most classified operational units, though I didn't know the details at 12. I knew only that he moved through rooms the way my father did, that compass needle adjustment, that quiet reorientation, and that when he and Jim talked, the conversation had a density that other conversations didn't. Real weight had been shared between them, the kind that doesn't require explaining. Rich visited in 1996 when I was 12. He sat at our kitchen table and talked with my father about deployments and units and men they both knew, and I sat at the other end of the table and listened without being invited in. At some point, he turned to me and asked what I wanted to do when I grew up. I said, serve. My father laughed uncomplicated, pleased, loud in a way he rarely was. It was one of the last times he would laugh that way about my future. At 12, I didn't know that. I just filed away the fact that Rich Connell had looked at me like I might belong in that world. And the look felt like something worth holding. Rich Connell was the first person from that world who ever looked at me like I might actually belong in it. I was 12. I filed it away. I enlisted in 2002. I was 18, and I knew exactly what I was doing, and I would be dishonest if I said my father wasn't part of it. Not the whole of it. I had my own reasons, but he was part of it. He drove me to the recruiter's office in Fairfax County on a Thursday morning in August. He shook the recruiter's hand and introduced himself as a retired sergeant major. The recruiter straightened immediately. My father was proud in the way he was only occasionally proud of me. Completely, without qualification, forward-facing. I signed the paperwork. Private Brigham. He told me on the drive home that I was going to be a fine soldier. I believed him. He had not considered the alternative. When I was selected for officer candidate school 2 years later, mid-enlistment, the call I made to tell him about it was the first time I heard what was underneath the pride. I was 20 years old, calling from a payphone at Fort Benning, and when I told him I had been selected, there was a pause before he responded. Not a long pause, a half second, maybe, but I heard it. He said, "Officer." Not congratulations, just the word flat, the way you repeat something from a foreign language when you're not sure you've heard it correctly. I told him, "Yes, officer." He said that was good, in the tone people use when they mean something more complicated. I hung up and did not analyze it. I was 20, and I needed the pause to mean surprise, so I decided that was what it meant. I would spend years deciding that. The commissioning ceremony was in May of 2006. I was 22 years old, and I pinned on second lieutenant bars in front of my parents and a small group of people from my unit. My mother cried quietly, her hand over her mouth. My father stood straight in his blazer with his sergeant major retirement pin on the lapel and shook my hand formally and told me I had earned it. I looked at his face for the pride I had seen at the recruiter's office 4 years earlier. It was not there in the same form. What was there instead was something more careful, something that had learned to measure. On the drive home that evening, with me in the back seat in my dress uniform, watching the highway pass in the dark, my father said to my mother that I was going to be doing administrative work at battalion level. Clerking, basically. Just to her, not to me. Just in the car, in the dark. I heard it. I did not correct him. I would not correct him for the next 15 years, and that silence which I told myself was grace, which I told myself was patience, would cost us both something neither of us had fully calculated. That was the first time he said it. Just to my mother, just in a car, just the two of them and me in the dark. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. By the time I understood it wasn't, I had stopped caring what he called it. That's the thing about absorbing something for long enough. You stop noticing the weight until the day you put it down. The years between 2007 and 2014 moved the way years move when you are doing serious work fast from the inside, compressed in memory. I deployed to Iraq in 2007 as a first lieutenant. I came home quieter, which is the right word, not damaged, not hollow, just compressed, the way a container gets, when the pressure outside exceeds the pressure inside, and it holds anyway. I was 23. My father did not ask about the deployment. He asked about my apartment. I was home for Thanksgiving that year, the first Thanksgiving home since enlisting. Jim's brother and his family were at the table, and Jim introduced me as their girl in the Army, doing some kind of administrative thing over at the intelligence side. His brother nodded and asked about my apartment. For 40 minutes, I answered questions about my apartment, the square footage, the neighborhood, whether I had found a good grocery store. No one asked about Iraq. I poured myself a second glass of water and answered every question with the full, pleasant attention of a woman who had learned to manage the distance between her internal life and her external one, which is a skill the Army teaches whether it intends to or not. I told myself he didn't know how to explain classified work to civilians. That was probably even true. It just wasn't the whole truth. By 2009, I was a captain, working in intelligence and special operations coordination out of a facility I was not in the habit of describing to family. Jim had a neighbor over that summer, a retired colonel, 06, infantry, the first officer I had encountered in a social setting with my father. The neighbor asked politely what I did. Before I could answer, Jim said, "She's a captain now, doing some admin work out of Fort Meade." The neighbor looked at me with mild interest and said, "Intelligence support?" I said, "Something like that." Jim changed the subject to football. A few minutes later, the neighbor glanced at me again. I recognized the look. He knew there was more. He was too polite to push. A retired colonel figured it out in 30 seconds. My father had 30 years on him and still hadn't looked. I noticed and told myself it didn't matter. In 2011, I called home to tell my parents I had been selected for a new assignment, a classified special operations billet that would require me to limit contact for extended periods. I could not say more than that. Jim asked if I was getting a promotion. I said yes, to major. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So you'll still be at the desk." It was not a question. I said something like that, Dad. He said, "Well, stay safe." I told him I would. That was the last real conversation we had about my career for 3 years. Afterward, the phrase entered regular rotation, not just to my mother in a car now, to anyone who asked. "She's my little clerk over at the agency. You know how it is government work. Always delivered with the same practiced warmth, the kind of warmth that has forgotten it was ever a choice." By 2011, I was 27 years old, a major select working in classified special operations, and my father was telling people I clerked at an agency near Meade, and I was letting him, because I had decided years ago that correcting him was a fight I didn't need, and because some part of me believed quietly, without examining it, that eventually he would simply ask, that eventually curiosity or concern or something would move him to just ask. He wasn't lying, exactly. He just stopped trying to find out what the truth was, and I let him. I told myself it was patience. I have since revised that assessment. He never asked. 2013, I was 29, a major, stopping by Jim's house on a Friday evening on my way back from the Pentagon. His poker group was there 4 retired enlisted men, all E7 and above, all infantry or armor. Jim introduced me as his daughter, some agency near Meade. One of the men, a retired first sergeant, a man with the specific gravity of someone who has spent a career reading people and situations, said, "Doing what?" Jim laughed. "Clerk work, basically. You know those agency types." The table laughed. I poured myself a glass of water and spent 20 minutes being pleasant, and then I left. On the way out, the retired first sergeant caught my eye. He didn't say anything. He had done the math, rank, age, clearance, the way I moved through a room, and had arrived somewhere that he recognized. My father never did that math. It had not occurred to him to do it, because he had already decided what I was, and decisions made early enough become invisible. You stop questioning what you have already decided, you have answered. He had not questioned it, not even once. By 2019, I was 35 years old and a colonel. I had been promoted through lieutenant colonel in 2016 and had commanded a classified counterterrorism element for 3 years before the promotion to 06 and the assignment that changed the scale of everything. Joint Special Operations Task Force Ghost, a classified counterterrorism task force operating across multiple theaters. My call sign was Ghost Actual. I could tell my father none of this. I told him I had received a new assignment. He said, "Good for you." He told his poker friends I had gotten a promotion at the agency. In 2022, I attended my cousin's wedding in Virginia Beach. I was 38 years old, a colonel commanding a task force with operators in 3 countries. Jim sat across from me at the family table. An uncle asked about the girls, Jim's sister's daughters, me, the cousins. When Jim got to me, he said, "Linda's been out at some agency near Meade for years. My little clerk couldn't tell you exactly what she does. All very hush-hush." He laughed. The table laughed. The uncle said, "Well, government work pays the bills." I smiled and drank my water. Under the table, my hand was very still. That was the one that stayed with me. Not because it was the worst, it wasn't, but because by then I was a colonel commanding a task force with operators in 3 countries, and he still hadn't asked. Not once in 15 years had he simply asked, and I had let that be. I had carried it as though it were mine to carry. I was still carrying it at that wedding table, 38 years old, smiling at something my aunt was saying, and I was counting. I wasn't sure what I was counting toward. I just knew I was counting. The drive home from Virginia Beach took 3 hours. I spent most of it on back roads with the radio off, thinking about the accounting I had been quietly running for 15 years and what it actually added up to. Not injury. I am not someone who tracks injury as a primary category. Something more precise than that. What I had accepted, what I had told myself it meant, what it actually meant. Those 3 things had never been the same, and I had spent 15 years pretending they were, because pretending was easier than the alternative, and because I had believed, without examining it, that eventually he would ask. He had not asked. He was not going to ask. The joke had been told so many times it had stopped being a choice. It was just what he said about his daughter, and I had let it become that. I drove home through the dark and let myself know that, fully, for the first time. The thing about letting a false story go on long enough is that eventually you forget it's false. My father forgot, and I let him. That was on both of us. On the Saturday before the brunch, I drove down from my base and slept in my childhood bedroom. I had been on a secure call for the last 40 minutes of the drive and operation in early activation. Nothing confirmed yet, but close enough that I kept the phone near. The bedroom was the same as it had always been. The same furniture, the same light from the same window, the same faint smell of the house I had grown up in. I lay there for a while before I slept and thought about nothing in particular, which is a skill and one I have worked at for years. Sunday morning, April 27th, 2024. I was 40 years old. I had been a colonel for 5 years. I had commanded Task Force Ghost for 5 years and run operations across 3 theaters. I had done all of that while my father told his poker buddies I was a clerk at an agency near Meade, and I had let him, and I had told myself for 15 years that letting him was a kind of mercy. Standing in my childhood bedroom the night before, I was less certain of that than I had ever been. I was not angry. I was just tired of the wait. Rich Connell was in town for a Naval Special Warfare reunion, his annual trip to Northern Virginia to see old teammates and old friends, Jim Brigham, chief among them. I had not seen Rich since I was in my 20s. I had heard about him the way you hear about people who move through your parents' lives, referenced, not present. I pulled up at 10 past 10. I had finished the secure call in the car, 2 sentences left when I parked. So I sat and finished them, and then I went inside. I was not frantic. I had been moving between classified and civilian spaces my entire adult life, and the transition was seamless by now. A door I opened and closed without thinking. I went inside. Jim was at the kitchen counter, pouring mimosas. Rich Connell was at the table. He was bigger than I remembered, silver-haired, broad across the shoulders, with the particular stillness of a man who spent his career learning to be quiet in places where noise got people killed. He stood when I came in. I extended my hand. He shook it and looked at me once, a quick, involuntary assessment, the kind that operators do without deciding to. I met his eyes. Something registered between us that Jim, still at the counter with his back half turned, did not notice. Rich Connell looked at me the way operators look at each other when they're trying to figure out if the other person has been where they've been. I gave him nothing. Force of habit. A few minutes later, Rich asked easily, without pressure, what I did for work. Jim was already laughing before Rich finished the question, a practice laugh. He set down the mimosa glasses and put his hand on the counter and looked at Rich the way a man looks when he is about to deliver a line he has delivered many times and is confident it will land. My little clerk can't even show up to brunch on time. The table laughed. Jim laughed. My mother smiled, the polite smile of a woman who has heard something so many times she no longer fully processes it. I sat down with my coffee. I did not smile. I had not corrected him in 15 years, and I was not going to start now over eggs and orange juice with a retired senior chief petty officer watching. Rich laughed along a polite laugh, not a real one. Then he looked at me directly and asked, "What agency?" A careful question. I met his eyes. "I'm not really able to get into it," I said. Rich nodded once slowly, the nod of a man who recognizes that answer from a very specific category of people. He picked up his fork. Jim was already talking about the reunion, something about a teammate from the early 90s who had made it up from Tampa. Linda's secure phone was in her purse on the chair beside her. At 10:19, the phone went off. 3 short tones from the case in my purse. Not a ring, a chirp, the activation signal for an operation moving from early phase to hot. I did not flinch. I reached in, checked the screen, and stood. I had been in this moment enough times to move through it without announcement or ceremony. The chair scraped back. I was already calculating. 38 seconds later, a black SUV rolled into the driveway. Jim and Rich saw it through the kitchen window at the same moment. 2 men in dark suits came to the door, knocked once, opened it without waiting, and stepped past Jim, past him, not stopping, not acknowledging him, crossing the kitchen floor directly to me. The lead agent, Marcus Webb, did not break stride. He spoke quietly and directly, the way he always spoke, which is without any wasted syllable. "Ma'am, Ghost is going hot. We need you airborne in 20. I nodded once. I put my coffee cup down on the counter, without hurry. Rich Connell had stopped moving entirely. He was holding his fork over his plate and he was staring at the lead agent, and then at me, and the color was leaving his face in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. He understood what he was looking at. He looked at Jim. "Jim, is your daughter Ghost actual?" Jim could not answer. He was 66 years old and he had spent 15 years certain he understood what his daughter did for a living. And in that moment, the certainty dissolved completely, and what was left underneath it was nothing. Just a man standing at his own kitchen counter, unable to find a word. The room was completely quiet. My father looked at me like I was someone he had never met, and I thought, this is what 15 years of a closed door looks like when it finally opens. I went to the front closet. My go bag was there. I had brought it the night before and put it there without explaining why, because I always brought it, because I have never once been somewhere that I was certain I could leave empty-handed. I slung it over one shoulder and crossed back through the kitchen. Jim was standing at the counter exactly where I had left him, not moving. I stopped. I put one hand on his cheek and kissed him once, briefly, the way you do something that has been waiting a long time to be done simply. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that 15 years of silence had not already said for me. I walked to the door. Rich Connell stood up from his chair, fully upright, heels together. Not a casual stand attention. The precise, deliberate posture of a man who has stood that way for decades and knows exactly when it is required. I passed him without stopping. The agents fell in behind me. The door closed. Rich Connell stood at attention. A retired senior chief petty officer with 3 DevGru tours stood at attention in my father's kitchen. My father watched him do it and still could not speak. I have thought about that moment many times since. About what Rich's posture communicated in the space of a second. About what it must have felt like to be Jim Brigham standing there absorbing it. Rich Connell did not stand at attention for sergeant majors. He stood at attention for people who had earned it in a specific way that he understood, and that my father was only now beginning to understand. That was the moment. Not the agents, not the SUV, not the call sign. That was the moment the 15 years arrived all at once. The black SUV pulled out of the driveway. Jim was at the kitchen window, watching it go. Rich Connell was still standing. I was airborne within 20 minutes. The morning folded behind me the way mornings do when the next thing requires your full attention completely, without remainder. I was gone, and the kitchen was gone with me, and Jim standing at the counter was gone, and Rich standing at attention in my father's house was gone. There was only the work, and the work was real, and the work needed doing. The operation ran through the afternoon, a clean activation, the kind where the plan holds and the only adjustments are small ones, the kind of day that reminds you why the preparation matters. I ran the coordination from a secure facility in the Washington area. My team was good. Everyone executed. There is a particular quality to a day like that. Not euphoric, not triumphant, just correct. Things went where they were supposed to go. That is the closest the job gets to peace. And I have learned to receive it without wanting to hold on to it, because the job does not stay peaceful for long. I did not think about the kitchen while I was working. That is not a coping strategy. That is simply what the job requires. The professional space and the personal space do not bleed into each other, and I have spent 22 years making sure of that. It took time, and it took discipline, and it took more than a few operational days where I had to make a deliberate choice to close a door in my head and stay behind it until the work was done. I had gotten good at that. I did not think about Jim at the kitchen counter, or Rich at the table, or the SUV in the driveway, or any of it. I worked. That was what there was to do. Back at Jim's house, nothing moved. Rich stayed. He was a guest, and beyond that, he was a man with enough operational experience to understand when you don't leave someone alone with something this large. Sandra made tea and retreated to the other room. She has always had the particular wisdom of knowing which silences she is needed in and which ones she isn't. Jim sat at the kitchen table in the same chair where he had been sitting when the agents walked in. Rich sat across from him and poured coffee and waited. Rich Connell is not a man who fills silence because he's uncomfortable. He can sit in it for as long as the situation requires. Eventually Jim asked, "You knew what ghost was?" Rich said yes. Jim asked how. Rich told him carefully, without flourish, that Ghost Actual has a reputation. Not public, not written anywhere, but the kind that moves through communities where people carry the clearance to hear it. He told Jim that every SEAL he knew who had operated in the same theaters as Task Force Ghost knew the call sign. He told Jim that Ghost Actual was not a clerk. "Jim, she runs operations that we support. The kind of support where nobody asks questions and nobody gets credit. You understand what I'm telling you?" Jim did not answer immediately. He sat with it. The afternoon light was moving across the kitchen floor the way it does in a house you have lived in long enough to know every angle of the light. Sandra had put a photograph on the mantle years ago, Linda, at maybe 14, the two of them at a baseball game, her laughing at something he had said. He looked at it for a long time. He had been, in that photograph, a man who knew what his daughter was going to become, or thought he did. He had decided, somewhere between that afternoon and this one, that he already had all the information he needed. He had not looked for more. That was the heart of it. Not malice, not contempt. An assumption made and then never revisited, because revisiting it would have required him to ask questions he was not certain he wanted answered. My father has always been better at certainty than at uncertainty. The uncertainty was here now, and it had arrived without warning, and he was sitting with it the only way he knew how, alone, in a kitchen, with a photograph. My mother told me later that he sat with that photograph for 2 hours. I don't know what he was thinking. I have my guesses. The ones that are most likely are also the ones that require the most honesty from him, which is a hard thing to ask of a man who has spent 66 years being certain. Rich found Jim on the back porch before dinner. He sat with him in the early evening, the light going orange, the neighborhood quiet the way suburban Northern Virginia gets quiet on Sunday evenings. A hush that has nothing to do with peace and everything to do with people finishing their day. Rich did not soften what he needed to say. That is not how men from their world operate, and beyond that, Jim would not have received a softened version. Jim respects directness the way he respects everything that costs someone something. You called her a clerk in front of me, Jim, in front of me. Do you understand what I'm sitting here feeling right now? Jim said he hadn't known. Rich said that was the problem, that Jim had never asked. That for 15 years he had made assumptions and built them into jokes, and delivered those jokes to anyone who would listen, and his daughter had stood there and said nothing. And Jim had taken her silence as confirmation instead of understanding it for what it actually was. She never corrected me. No, she didn't. You should think about why. Jim had no answer for that. He looked at the yard. He was a man who had spent 25 years having answers, who had built a career on having answers faster and more reliably than the men around him, and he was sitting on his back porch without one, which was a new kind of quiet for him. I came back around 9 o'clock. Rich had gone to his hotel. Sandra was in bed. Jim was still at the kitchen table, same chair, same posture. A man who had not known what to do with himself for 11 hours and had not moved while he tried to figure it out. I set my go bag down by the door. I poured water from the tap and drank it standing at the sink with my back to him. Then I turned. He was looking at the table. He could not look at me, my father, who had looked at everything hard and without flinching for 66 years. I watched him for a moment, and for the first time in a very long time, I saw past the thing he had been doing to what was underneath it. It was not contempt. It had never been contempt. It was shame. He had been ashamed of his own ceiling, of the commission he had never pursued, of watching his daughter go past every marker he had set as the definition of service, and he had turned that shame outward for 15 years and called it a joke. And I had absorbed it as though it were mine. We had been doing that to each other for a long time without either of us naming it. I named it that night, standing at the sink with a glass of water, watching him look at the table. And then I went to bed. I lay in my childhood bedroom for a while in the dark, looking at the ceiling I had looked at all my life, and I thought about what it means to carry something so long that you forget it has a name. I had been carrying it since the car ride home from my commissioning ceremony in 2006. That was 18 years. A long time to absorb something that was never yours to carry. I had a decision to make. I did not make it that night, but I knew it was coming. I did not confront him that night. He was not ready, and more to the point, neither was I. Readiness is something I understand professionally. You do not move until the conditions support the movement, not because you are afraid of moving, but because a premature move costs more than a patient one. The conditions for that conversation were not correct on the night of April 27th. I went to bed in my childhood bedroom and drove back to my base in the morning and sat at my own kitchen table 2 weeks later and did the accounting. I am not a journaler. I do not write things down to understand them. I sit with them until they resolve, which is a slower process and sometimes a more accurate one. I sat with 15 years. Every family gathering, every poker night, every cousin's wedding, every time someone laughed and I smiled and said nothing. I was not cataloging injuries. That is not a framework I find useful. I was doing something more precise, tracking what I had accepted, what I had told myself it meant, and what it actually meant. Those 3 things had never been the same, and I had spent 15 years pretending they were, because pretending was easier than the alternative, and because I had believed quietly, without examining it, that eventually he would simply ask. He had not asked. He was not going to ask. The joke had been told so many times it had stopped being a choice. It had become part of the furniture of how he presented himself and his family, the retired sergeant major with the daughter at the agency, the clerk, the government girl, and he had arranged the rest of the room around it so many times that he no longer noticed it was furniture at all. It was just what he said when someone asked about his daughter, and I had let it become that. I had smiled and said nothing for 15 years. That was on me as much as it was on him, and I was going to have to sit with my portion of it before I could say anything honest to him about his. I didn't decide to punish him. I decided to stop protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. Those are different things, even when they look the same from the outside. Jim called in early May. A week later than he usually called after a visit, a gap I noticed and did not remark on. He asked if I had made it back all right. I said yes. He asked how work was. I said, which part? A silence. He said, all of it, I suppose. He was trying to get somewhere, and he was not built for the terrain. He said Rich had called him. I said I knew Rich had texted me. Another silence. He said, I didn't know what you did. I said, I know you didn't, Dad. He said, you never told me. And that was where I made the decision I had been preparing for without knowing it. You never asked. The silence after that was the longest one in 15 years. I let it be long. I did not fill it in for him. He had to sit in it, which was not something he had practice at. Jim Brigham had spent 25 years in an institution that fills silences with mission and structure and chain of command. Retirement had given him routines to fill the rest. This particular silence, the one that lives in the space between what you have done to someone and what you owe them for, it was new territory. I was not going to make it easier. Easier would not help either of us. My mother called on a Sunday in May. Sandra has always been the more honest of the two of them, she says what is true, without requiring it to be comfortable first. She told me Jim was struggling. I said I understood that. She said he wanted to make it right. I said I knew, but that he would have to figure out what that looked like. She asked if I was angry. I thought about it honestly, which she deserved. I'm not angry, Mom. I'm just done explaining away something that was never actually confusing. She went quiet when I said that. I think she had been waiting for one of us to say something true out loud for a long time. She was ready to hear it. She had always been ready to hear it. My mother has been the honest one for as long as I can remember, and she has absorbed 30 years of the space between my father and me, and never once complained about the weight of it. I owed her a true thing, and I had given her one, and I could hear in the quiet after I said it that it had landed somewhere she had been waiting for it to land. I went for Sunday dinner at the end of May. Dinner, not brunch, my choice of time, a small thing that was not small. Jim had cooked, which was unusual. He was formal and careful throughout the meal, the way men are when they have rehearsed an apology and cannot find the right place in the conversation to put it. He got through dinner without finding the moment. We watched the news for an hour afterward. When I stood to leave, he said what he had been holding all evening. I should have asked. I know that. I should have asked a long time ago. I picked up my keys. I looked at him for a moment at my father, 66 years old, standing in his kitchen in the house he had lived in for 30 years. Looking at me with the specific discomfort of a man who is used to having answers and is standing in territory that doesn't have them. He had rehearsed something. I could see the shape of it in how he held himself, that extra inch of posture, the prepared breath. He had gotten to the end of the evening without finding the right door for it, and he was relieved and disappointed in equal measure that he had to put it into words with no warm-up, no runway. Just him and me in the kitchen at the end of a Sunday, the television quiet in the other room, and 15 years of the wrong story between us. Yeah, Dad, you should have. Not cold. Honest. There is a difference, and it matters, and I needed him to know I understood the difference. He nodded. He didn't argue with it. That was new, the not arguing. I had expected something more from him, some residual reflex toward defense, and it didn't come. He just stood there and took it, which told me more about where he was than anything he could have said. I drove home with the windows down through the dark, not crying, not angry, just moving forward through the night with something lighter in the car than what had been there on the way down. Rich called in June from San Diego. Old teammates, he said. The maintenance circuit that men from that world keep because the bonds formed in places like that don't require regular contact to stay intact. He asked how things stood with Jim. I told him honestly and without drama or omission. Rich listened. He told me he had said his piece to Jim directly, and he stood by every word of it. And then he said something I sat with for several days. He was proud of you, Linda. He just didn't know how to be proud of something he couldn't understand. That's not an excuse. I just think you should know it was in there. I believed Rich. I just wasn't sure yet whether that made it better. Whether pride that you couldn't express, that you covered over with diminishment for 15 years, still counts as pride. I am still working on that question. I suspect I will be working on it for a while yet. Jim Brigham has never been good at sitting with something he cannot fix. 25 years of infantry does that to a man. You identify problems and move toward solutions, because the alternative in that profession is catastrophic and unacceptable. What he was sitting with now had no solution in any field manual he had ever studied. He had spent 15 years building a story about his daughter, and he had told it to everyone who asked, and now every one of those interactions was sitting in his memory like a debt he couldn't close. He could not go back. He could only go forward, and forward required something he had not been trained for, the ability to sit with uncertainty and not reach for a quick resolution. He was not good at it. He had never had occasion to practice it. For 25 years, the Army had given him the structure to move through uncertainty without having to fully feel it. The mission provided direction, the chain of command provided context, and even the hardest days had a framework. Retirement had taken the framework. What he had in its place was Sandra, his routines, his poker group, and a version of his daughter that he was now discovering had been wrong for 15 years. He was 66 years old and he was starting over on a single relationship, which is not a thing that men from his background are built to do gracefully. He was doing it anyway. I gave him credit for that, even when it was hard to give him anything. He stopped volunteering the clerk line. I know this because Sandra told me, and because the retired first sergeant from the poker group told Rich, and Rich told me. Jim stopped offering the joke even when given openings, when someone asked about his kids, when a neighbor made conversation about Linda at the agency and he did not replace it with anything immediately, because he still did not fully know what to replace it with. He could not say what his daughter did. He only knew, now, what she was. And that knowledge, unmoored from the framework he had used to understand her for 15 years, sat in him and did its slow, necessary work. In June, he told his poker group that Linda commanded a task force. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The retired first sergeant, the one who had caught my eye years ago at that very same table, who had done the math in 30 seconds and arrived somewhere that night, looked at Jim and said, I had a feeling. Jim said nothing. He picked up his cards. The table moved on, because they were all from a world that knows when not to push. My mother told me about that poker night. She said he came home quieter than usual. I thought about what it must have cost him not to say task force commander to strangers, but to say it to men who understood exactly what those words meant. In July, I ran with my colleague on a Tuesday morning another colonel, a woman I had known since our captain years, a woman who had watched me navigate a lot of hard operational and personal terrain over 2 decades and had never once offered unsolicited advice about any of it. She had the restraint and the judgment to ask questions instead of giving answers. She was one of the few people in my life who had both the clearance and the relationship to know the family situation in general terms, and who I trusted to hold it without doing anything with it I hadn't asked for. She asked how things were with Jim. I told her about the brunch, the phone calls, the late May dinner. She listened without interrupting. At the end, she asked, What do you want from him? I ran 3 steps before I answered. I want him to understand that the 15 years before last Sunday actually happened. I wasn't asking for a groveling apology. I was asking for acknowledgement that what he did was real, that I had absorbed it for a long time, and that his ignorance was a choice he made over and over again. I had choices to make too. I had chosen silence for 15 years. I had chosen patience that was sometimes just avoidance. I had chosen to carry something that was not entirely mine to carry, and I had done it for so long that I had stopped noticing the weight of it. We were both going to have to reckon with our own portion of this. His choices were larger and more public and had cost me more directly. Mine were quieter and possibly more stubborn. I was going to have to look at both. Jim and Sandra went to the Outer Banks in August, their annual week, a tradition they had kept for 30 years through deployments and retirements and everything else that life had required of them. Sandra told me later that Jim spent more evenings than usual on the porch, quiet, a book in his lap that he opened once and did not read. He sat and he watched the water and thought, she said. Or at least she assumed he was thinking hard. He had the look of a man doing the kind of internal work that doesn't produce anything visible. He asked Sandra once what I had been like in my 20s, in my 30s, the way a man asks when he is reviewing footage of something he missed and is trying to build an accurate picture from memory. Sandra told him as much as she could remember, the deployments, the promotions she had heard about secondhand, the way Linda had carried herself at every family gathering for 15 years, with a patience Sandra had always found remarkable. They sat with it together on the porch in the evenings. He told Sandra he didn't think he had ever looked at me straight. Sandra said, No, you hadn't. And he took that without arguing, which was the most significant thing she told me about that week. My mother has always been the more honest of the two of them. It took him 66 years to let that honesty in without redirecting it. That is a long time. But it is not too late, and I know the difference between those two things. He called on a Saturday in September. He was not practiced. Not smooth. He is not a man who navigates this kind of conversation with ease, and he was not pretending otherwise. I think I said it because it was easier than admitting I didn't know, and then it became a habit, and habits are a pause. Habits are hard to see when you're in them. I listened. I did not fill in the silence for him. He had to get there on his own, which is the only way it counts. In October, Task Force Ghost ran a successful operation in a secondary theater. I was in the coordination center for 36 hours. Everything executed. Everyone came home. When I finally slept, I did so without the full weight I had carried for 15 years, the weight of being dismissed in my personal life while being trusted with everything in my professional one. The weight was not entirely gone. These things do not vanish on a schedule. But it was lighter. I could feel the difference the way you feel the difference when a chronic pressure becomes less chronic, not healed, but changed, moving in the right direction. 36 hours of work, a successful operation, a team that performed correctly, and then sleep without the full ballast of something I had been carrying since 2006. That was progress. I was learning to call it that without waiting for it to be more. The job always gave me what the family couldn't, the clarity of being seen accurately. I didn't need them to see me the way the job did. I just needed them to stop deciding what I was before they looked. That sounds like a small thing. It isn't. There is no single moment where everything changes. That is the first thing I had to accept about rebuilding a relationship with my father, that there would be no scene, no conversation, no exchange of the exact right words that would lift the weight and put things right. What there was instead was accumulation. Smaller choices, made repeatedly by two people who had been making the wrong ones for a long time. Jim started making different choices. I started noticing them. Neither of us named what we were doing, because naming it would have put pressure on something that could not yet support it. Thanksgiving in 2024. He opened the door and stepped back to let me in with a deliberateness I had not seen before, a beat longer than usual, as though he was paying attention to the act rather than just executing it. He did not make a joke. We sat at the table, just the three of us, and he asked about my career in a way he never had. Not what I did, how I got there, what it had looked like from the inside. The officer candidate school process, the Iraq deployment, the transitions from tactical to operational to strategic work, the promotions and what each one actually required. He listened without redirecting. My mother watched him listen, and something in her face settled that I had not seen settled before. After dinner, he asked about officer candidate school, specifically what I had been thinking when I decided to go for it. He asked it carefully, the way a man asks something he has been rehearsing. I told him the truth. I went for it because I wanted to lead, not just execute. Because I wanted to set the direction, not just carry it out. He sat with that. Then he said he thought he had made my commission about himself when it happened, that he had felt it as a challenge, even though I had never meant it as one. You were 20, and you went after something I never went after. I told myself it wasn't the same kind of service, but I was wrong about that. I know you were. Not harsh, just true. He took it without defending himself. That was new, and I gave him full credit for it. In December, Rich Connell visited. He and Jim had dinner alone, and Rich told me afterward that Jim had talked about me differently the entire evening, used the word colonel 3 times, and when a friend called and asked about his children, Jim said, "My daughter commands a task force. She's a colonel." Rich sat there and said nothing, not wanting to break the moment. I asked Rich how Jim had sounded when he said it. Rich was quiet for a second. Then, proud. He sounded proud. I decided to let that be what it was. A man arriving late to something that deserved his attention. Late, but arrived. New Year's. Before I left, I said what I had been holding for months, directly, without softening it. I'm not going to go back to before. I'm not going to perform the version of our relationship where you know nothing about my life and I smile about it. If you want to be in my life, you need to actually be in it. That means asking, even when you don't understand the answers. He said, "Okay." One word, from a man who had spent 66 years being certain about everything. It carried more weight than a longer sentence would have. Okay was not everything, but it was something I had never had from him before, an agreement to try. By February of 2025, the loudest part had passed. Jim was different in small ways that were not small at all. He asked questions. He used my rank when he spoke about me. He had stopped filling silence with jokes and started filling it with attention. I was different too, lighter. For the first time in years, I was not performing something for his benefit, not managing his version of me, not absorbing a story that wasn't mine. The space that opened when I stopped doing that was larger than I expected. In April, a small veterans event at a local university. I attended privately, in civilian clothes. Jim asked if he could come, and I said yes, surprised, but yes. He sat beside me in the back row. When it ended, a retired general caught my eye across the room and gave me a brief nod, the the kind that passes between people who know each other from classified spaces. Jim noticed. He knew who you were. Yes. How many of them know who you are? More than you think. He was quiet the rest of the way to the car, not uncomfortable, absorbing. May 2025. I drove to Jim's house for brunch, my choice. Deliberately. He opened the door before I knocked, wearing the same flannel shirt he has worn to 100 Sunday mornings. He looked at me, not through me, not at the version of me he had arranged, at me. I had been waiting for that for a long time. We had breakfast, sat on the back porch with coffee, and he told me about the poker night in June, about saying task force commander to his friends for the first time, about what the retired first sergeant had said. He told me he understood, in that moment, that the people who had been paying attention had always known, and that he had been the one person in my life who chose not to. I wasted a lot of time being proud of the wrong thing. You weren't proud of the wrong thing. You just decided mine was lesser, and that was wrong. He took that without arguing. He has gotten better at it. When I left, he walked me to the car and put his hand on my shoulder once, just once, firmly. I'm proud of you, Linda. I should have been saying that for a long time. I'm saying it now. I know, Dad. I drove north on a clear May morning with nothing in the way. I didn't need him to understand every part of what I do. I just needed him to respect that it was real. He finally does. That is enough to build on. And building on something I have learned is the whole point. You made it to the end, and if this story hit something in you, you already know why. My father didn't set out to diminish me. He just never stopped to look. And sometimes that's the hardest kind of hurt to name, not the sharp betrayal, but the slow, quiet assumption that you are less than what you are. If someone in your life has done that to you, a parent, a partner, anyone who decided what you were before they ever really looked, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. You might be surprised how many people are sitting with the exact same thing. And before you go, a few questions for you. Is there someone in your life who has never seen you accurately, and have you ever corrected them? Or did you do what I did and carry it in silence? If you were in Rich Connell's seat that morning watching all of it unfold in real time, what would you have done? And the one I think about most, is there a difference between patience and self-erasure, and how do you know which one you've been practicing? Leave your answers below. I read everyone. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.